And thank you to everyone who's joining us today. It's really wonderful to see such a large group of people interested and passionate about this issue and looking to learn more, particularly in this time that we're all facing. As Emmy said, I'm Megan Whitaker. I'm the Director of Policy and Advocacy for the National Center for Learning Disabilities. That means I lead NCLD's policy work, mostly at the federal level, and I engage with policymakers in Washington, D.C. on issues relating to education from early childhood through post-secondary. But one issue that I have been really focused on in particular over the last 2 years has been the identification of students with learning disabilities and the complexities that exist in that evaluation process for students of color and for English learners. So I'm excited to be with you all today and to speak about a topic that I would argue is more critical now than ever. I think we're really at a turning point in education in a lot of ways, and that topic is equity in special education. And I really want to focus today on how we can advance that and make a difference moving forward. And let me advance these slides. So we may only get to skim the surface of some of these issues. There's a lot more information out there and available, and I'm happy to provide resources. But my goal is to give a quick history of disability and a snapshot of where special education is today, recognizing we may not all come from the same experience or understanding of special education, and give a glimpse into some of those persistent and systemic issues that do affect equity in special ed, and then really think about how the COVID-19 crisis is impacting special education and how we can use this moment to really make a change. So for those who may not be familiar with NCLD, we are a nonprofit organization created more than 40 years ago by parents who had a child with learning disabilities, and they really struggled to find the right supports for their child to thrive. They made it their mission to ensure that other parents didn't have to experience that same challenge. And today our mission has really expanded to improving the lives of the 1 in 5 children who struggle with learning and attention issues. And in many cases, we advocate on behalf of all students with disabilities, and that is more than 6 million students across our country in our public schools today. NCLD does our work through 3 main ways: policy, research, and young adult leadership and advocacy. We work primarily at the national level across a variety of early childhood, K-12, and higher education issues, really working with partners to influence policy, to remove barriers and increase opportunities for students with learning and attention issues. And we also work with and convene some of the top experts in the field of learning disabilities to push our thinking on important education issues. We conduct our own research and commission other research to really hone in on what are the best practices for students with learning and attention issues and make sure that disability is part of the conversation, particularly when we think about education reform and innovation. And we've recently launched a large effort to engage with young adults across the country who themselves have learning and attention issues, to both ensure that their voices are part of the policy and advocacy efforts that we engage in, and also to provide them with leadership, advocacy, and community building opportunities related to the issues that they care about. So to jump into the discussion today, I like to start with this timeline of kind of how we've gotten to where we are today. Many of you may know this, but before 1975, children with disabilities were not allowed in public schools in many states. There was no requirement that they receive an education. And in many places, they were actually forbidden from attending our public schools. Many children with disabilities were institutionalized and they didn't receive any education at all. And it wasn't until a journalist saw the conditions that students with disabilities were kept in some of those institutions, and that journalist decided to highlight the issue by taking photographs and publishing a book. And Congress paid attention to that. And what resulted after many years of advocacy and bringing that kind of attention to the issue was that Congress passed the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, what you probably know as IDEA, in 1975. And that law required public schools to find every child with a disability and ensure that their education is tailored to their needs. The goal was to make sure that these students, like everyone else, could access and benefit from their education. And over the years, as you can see here, several other laws have passed that have really increased accessibility for people with disabilities in our society. You've probably heard about the Americans with Disabilities Act, which passed 30 years ago next week. And that governs accessibility in public spaces like parking spaces, restrooms, and more. And then No Child Left Behind, which I think a lot of us have history with. Some folks have supported No Child Left Behind, others have had challenges with it. But that law really secured the belief that students with disabilities are general education students first. It required all students with disabilities, except for a small portion of them, to take the same assessments and be held to the same challenging academic standards as their peers without disabilities. But that took 25 years from when IDEA passed for our education system to recognize the potential and the worth of students with disabilities. And together, these special education and general education laws really work to put students with disabilities on equal footing as other students and give them the same opportunities. And we have certainly come a long way. One of the goals of IDEA was inclusion for students with disabilities. And I think we can say we've done a pretty good job of that. If you look at the data point I have here, we went from, before 1975, students with disabilities being separated from other children not receiving an education, to today, where if you're looking at the students that NCLD particularly focuses on, those with learning disabilities or attention issues, we know that 70% of them spend most of their day in general education classrooms. So that's progress. And that number has gone up quite a bit. And many, if we look at students with disabilities as a whole, they do spend a lot of their time in general education classrooms with non-disabled peers. We know that graduation rates are going up. We know that awareness about disability is increasing and stigma is decreasing. But at the same time, our education system is still failing students in many ways. And this is something that I think deserves a really deep look at who is affected and why. And this data comes from the National Assessment for Educational Progress, which I know that is not always a perfect indicator of how students are doing, but it is the comparable data that we have across states. And even though we know that students with learning disabilities are just as intelligent as students without disabilities, we do know that they have lower self-efficacy and worse academic outcomes in the long run. And on this NAEP assessment, it's data from 2013, but it is, we dug into it to distinguish not just looking at students with disabilities, but by particular disability categories. We found that 96% of 8th graders with learning disabilities were below proficient in both reading and math. So that means almost no students with learning disabilities were proficient in those areas. And that's a troubling data point. But, and we know that when we don't address academics, we don't provide the right supports and instruction to students with disabilities, there could be a ripple effect. And students with learning disabilities have a dropout rate 3 times as high as students without disabilities. 41% of students with learning disabilities will complete college of those who attend. They're twice as likely to be jobless. And 50% of them will report some involvement with the justice system within 8 years of leaving high school. And these outcomes, I think we would all agree, are not acceptable. And unfortunately, they happen all too often for students with disabilities and for other groups of students as well. But there are particular consequences for students of color, and that's really what we're going to focus on today. Not only do we know that students of color are more likely to attend high poverty school districts that may have fewer resources to support them, but there are also disproportional outcomes when it comes to their achievement and their experience in school. And you've probably heard of disproportionality, and some of the data that we know around significant disproportionality is that 1 in 4 Black males with IEPs will receive suspensions compared to 1 in 10 white males with IEPs. And we also know when we look at graduation data, 35% of Black, Hispanic, and Native American students will leave high school without a diploma. They may drop out, they may receive some other credential, and that's compared to 25% of Asian and white students. So there's a discrepancy there in how these students are leaving high school. And these disparities are persistent in education across these indicators, as well as other kinds of outcome data. And there's a large body of research and a lot of kind of political discussion about what we refer to as significant disproportionality in special education. And essentially, this is the idea that, in comparison to their general education, their general enrollment in public schools, students of color are overrepresented in special education. The idea is that if you make up, let's say, 20% of the general student body, people of a particular race, they should also probably make up about 20% of special education population. We don't necessarily expect there to be different prevalence rates across different races. But the reality, though, is that students of color make up a larger proportion of the special education population. They are underrepresented when it comes to accessing high quality instruction. They are underrepresented when it comes to accessing different kinds of services. And they're more likely to be disciplined for the same behaviors or the same actions, but more frequently and with harsher punishment than white peers. So it really, in simple terms, they're more likely than white students to have negative experiences in schools, both in terms of special education and in discipline policies. And it has led to some kind of, at times, heated discussions about the cause. Why does this happen? What's at the root of it? As you can see this headline, is special education racist? And there are two schools of thought on this, and I'm not yet going to comment on kind of where the research, where it has come out in recent years, but there's two schools of thought that I just want to present to you. The first takes an approach that considers prevalence. It says, you know, the reason that students of color are more likely to be placed into special education is because the rates of disability are higher in those communities. People who support this theory might suggest that because students of color are also more likely to be low income, they may be exposed to more things that can lead to a higher rate of disability. Poor nutrition, exposure to lead, trauma. Those are things that we know can be linked to disability. But the question is income the factor here, or is it race? And how do we parse that out? The comparison point that is often used to support this prevalence theory is that, you know, if we take asthma, for example, we recognize that there are higher rates of asthma, a medical condition, among students of color, and we attribute it to their environment. We treat it, we acknowledge that it exists, and we still try to, you know, solve the problem and address it for them. So why don't we do the same thing in special education? If these students need access to special education, and why can't we just acknowledge that they have a higher rate of need than white students? So that's one school of thought. And on the other hand, we have the bias theory. And that suggests that students of color are more likely to be identified because of bias that exists within our education system, the policies, the practices that shape our evaluations and our eligibility processes. Students who are different from those conducting the evaluations might be seen as standing out and might be subject to kind of unfair decision-making and bias within the teams and the practices that are used in the schools. So what is going on here? And before we get further into it, I think it's helpful to just step back and kind of understand the process that schools engage in when they're making these decisions, so that we can kind of understand what goes into them and which theory might be at play here. So the students that we're talking about, IDEA serves a broad, a wide variety of students with disabilities. There are 13 categories recognized under the law, all of which are very different from each other. Within each of these 13 categories, there can be multiple types of disabilities or diagnoses. And even within the same type of disability, the needs of students can and will differ from the next. So no two students with specific learning disabilities are going to look the same, need the same things, score the same on assessments. And so these are the 13 categories recognized in law. And it's important to know that these are not necessarily medical diagnoses. Some may be, but others are disabilities that the school largely determines. And we'll talk about a few of those and why that matters. So this chart shows the breakdown of students with disabilities by category, and it shows the percentage that they make up in the special education population. You can see which disabilities are more common and which are less common. The largest category here under IDEA is specific learning disabilities, the blue category all the way to the right of your screen at a nearly 38%. And that is the largest category of disability, specific learning disabilities, or LD, or learning disabilities. And then these are characterized by what in the law, clearly defines what these are and lays out an entire process that schools must go through. But they describe what is called the imperfect ability to read, think, write, do math, concentrate, a whole series of activities that most students rely on in school. And it covers disorders you may have heard of, like dyslexia, a reading disability, or dyscalculia, a math disability. And it's an example of a disability that can be hard to accurately identify, because you see a student who's low achieving or low performing on academic assessments, and you have to separate out, is this student struggling to learn because of the quality of their instruction, or is it because of external factors or other needs that have gone unmet? And is it really truly a brain-based difference that's leading to their struggle, or is there something else going on here? So that's one example of a disability that schools largely have to weigh in on. And another large category is speech language impairment, which you see as the orange category towards the bottom of the pie chart. And this is one, around 20% or a little less than 20% in most states. Another third category that is a high rate is other health impairment, which oftentimes will cover students who have medical conditions that impact their education. But interestingly, a large proportion, as much as 70% of students in this category, actually have ADHD. And then, there are, that's about 2/3 of the special education population under those three categories. But there are other disabilities, such as intellectual disabilities, and those are characterized by problems or limitations in intellectual functioning, like learning, problem solving, judgment, as well as adaptive behavior, such as communication or independent living. And emotional disturbance is another important one that has implications for our conversation today. And that's described as an inability to learn, but not due to intellectual or health factors, but inability to maintain relationships, inappropriate behavior, or mood difficulties. So these are some examples, and I just want us to be thinking through the differences in types of disabilities, how they're identified, who's involved in the identification process, because there's a wide variety here and a lot of factors at play. But no matter which category a student may fall under, the law requires the same types of things. And IDEA, I want no parts of the conversation today to suggest that IDEA isn't important and doesn't offer really important benefits to students who need these services. So for any child who is found eligible under IDEA, certain things are guaranteed to them. First, IDEA is premised on this idea of child find, which many of you likely know, and it requires districts to locate or find, identify, and evaluate any child that has a disability. A parent might worry that their child has a disability and they may request an evaluation. A teacher might request the evaluation, but either way, the evaluation process begins and the district is responsible. But the obligation is on the district to conduct that evaluation and make a determination about whether the student is eligible under IDEA. There's a two-pronged test there that's very important that I will talk through in more depth in just a minute. And then second, IDEA entitles those students to certain things if they're found eligible. They are entitled to what we call FAPE, a free appropriate public education, essentially a free education designed to meet their individual needs. It includes accommodations or services to help that student benefit from and make progress in their education. It also says that students with disabilities need to be educated alongside their peers without disabilities to the maximum extent possible. This is known as the least restrictive environment requirement, LRE, which also is important if we're talking about significant disproportionality, because that is one factor in that analysis. And research shows that inclusion has benefits not just for students with disabilities, but for peers that don't have disabilities in the classroom, as well as for teachers. So there's a lot of benefits, and I think a bedrock of IDEA is that we value the idea of inclusion and believe that students should be educated in general education as much as possible. We recognize that there is a small percentage of students who will need more intensive supports, one-on-one help, and need a different settings, and that is absolutely appropriate for those students. And so there's this continuum that we think about. General education or full inclusion is optimal for students who can succeed there. That's kind of on one side. And then on the other side of that continuum is the segregated setting, a separate placement at the other end of the spectrum for students who really need it and who have not been successful in different settings. And then once a student is, found eligible and you've talked through their type of disability, what their proper placement is, they get an IEP, an individualized education program that lays out how this specialized instruction or related services will be provided to that student. And then of course there are the procedural safeguards, the guarantees that parents have to be part of their educational process to handle disputes or resolutions with the district and things like that. And all of that sounds great. All of these things are really beneficial and important. These services are needed for many students. And so for those who are eligible and who are accurately identified, IDEA is essential. But for some kids, IDEA is not quite that beneficial. And there's kind of a bigger picture that I think we need to look at here. So the core components I just talked about make up a kind of a process of eligibility that unfolds, and there's important implications here. The two-pronged test that I mentioned to actually qualify for special education is shown here in the first column. Students need to not only have a disability that fits under one of those 13 categories under IDEA, but it also, you need to determine that the special education is needed for that student to access the curriculum. So that's the first step. Think about a student with a physical disability. They might be in a wheelchair. They have a disability, but it doesn't necessarily affect their ability to sit in the classroom or to engage with instruction. So that is the kind of test we're doing here to make sure that the disability impacts their learning in a way that's sufficient to need services. The next part of the process that we move on to is identification, identifying what the disability is. And this is where I think we often run into issues with significant disproportionality. Essentially, data tells us that students of color and English learners are identified at a higher rate than their white peers. Some disabilities have a pretty objective process that's followed to identify or diagnose them. If you think about hearing or visual impairments, those are 2 categories under the 13. A doctor can give you a vision test and know right away whether you're blind. The same goes for a hearing test. A lot of these medical tests are very black and white. They're objective, no matter what the doctor thinks about you or believes about you, your background, your culture. The result of the test drives the decision that is made about your treatment. But for some disabilities, like I mentioned, learning disabilities or emotional disturbances, a large part of the decision-making process falls on educators to share their observations from the classroom, to discuss and talk about what they believe a child is exhibiting, how they believe a child should be achieving, and make that decision. There's no simple test, but it's a series of these decisions, these assessments, these observations that are compiled by a team, and we're all human. Everybody has biases, and if this process allows this many decision points, this many kinds of components to it, as it does under IDEA, that can leave room for bias, and it can lead to inconsistency in identification, and it can lead to inaccuracy in identification. So, I highlighted all the things IDEA provides. I highlighted the services you get, the IEP you get, the rights your parents get. There can also be some harms, as I mentioned, particularly for students who might be misidentified. And very often, students with disabilities are seen as less intelligent or less capable. Expectations can be lowered for students in special education. Oftentimes, we see the rigor of classes might decrease for those students. And there's also a stigma that's associated with it. You may have seen, parents or certain communities who don't want to engage in the IDEA process because they're not looking to have another label attached to them. This stigma is a very real concern for a lot of families and parents. And for students of color, for English learners, for low-income students, adding to, this stigma, these, lower expectations can be very detrimental to their success and to their, their outcomes. And then finally, once a student is determined to be eligible, they'll be given a placement. And I talked about the requirement of least restrictive environment. There are kind of tiers of placement. We think of full inclusion as spending 80 to 100% of your day in general education. And we think of, a substantially separate or segregated setting as one where students spend less than 40% of their time. And, for students with learning disabilities, students who may have speech or language impairments, they are likely to be more fully included in general education classroom and may be pulled out for short portions of the day to receive specific kinds of instruction or services. But for students with more significant needs, they are likely to be placed in more segregated settings. And oftentimes, students who are in segregated settings, away from their peers, miss out on social interactions. They don't have the same access to the high standards, general education content, or to advanced or more rigorous coursework. So these are just some considerations as we think about the benefits versus the harms that can come with a label of being in special education and the placements that you might be assigned to. So, it's incredibly important that people understand, we all work every day hard to protect the law and guarantee that these rights are available to students. And we also need to make sure that we're equally ensuring that the way the law is implemented, the processes that are being carried out within schools or districts are done so in a fair and equitable way that meets the needs of students. And I think that there's still a lot of work to be done in that regard, both in terms of our understanding of these complexities and our processes and policies that help carry them out. So we left off kind of thinking about these 2 theories of disproportionality, the prevalence and the bias theory. And I want to share with you some research that has come out within the last year or so. And I have worked with Todd Grindle and Laura Shifter out of Harvard, and they really decided to kind of try to settle this debate or look more deeply into these 2 theories of prevalence and bias theory. And answer the question, is there a higher prevalence of disability among students of color? What role does income play? What role does race play? And how much does bias have to do with the identification process? So Todd Grindle and Laura Shifter have done this work out of Harvard. They used statewide data from 3 states. So they looked at data on every student in special education in those 3 states. They couldn't name specifically what 3 states they were, but they varied in size, they varied in demographics, and they varied in the geographies in terms of urban and rural kinds of districts. And they recognize that in the United States, race and income are often correlated. And so it can be those can be hard factors to really parse out, but they wanted to make sure that they could identify how these two different characteristics might impact special education eligibility. So first, they looked at income. They looked at the differences between income categories, comparing all low-income students to all non-low-income students. And then they looked at race, specifically to see if there were patterns based on income alone. So looking at Black students who are low income compared to Black students who are non-low income to see if there were differences. But they also wanted to look at race independent of income. So they asked, when we look at students within the same income category, either all low income students or all non-low income students, are students of color in either of those more likely to be identified than their white counterparts in that same income category? The second research question that they really set out to look at was about placement. Are students of color, once they are identified as being eligible for special education, are they more likely to be placed in a more segregated classroom setting? And the findings were incredibly important. They found that income does play a role. Low-income students were more likely than non-low-income students to be placed in special education, and that held true across all races. So white low-income students were more likely than white non-low-income students to be placed in special education, and the same was true for Black students and Latino students. So they found that race plays a role independent of income. You're looking at students from the same income category, both low-income and non-low-income. Black and Hispanic students were more likely than white students to be placed in special education. So for low-income students, Black and Hispanic students are more likely to be placed in special ed, and for non-low-income students, the same was true, regardless of income. But the interesting thing was that those patterns don't exist for all disabilities. They exist for certain types of disabilities, and only those that are primarily identified by school. And I saw in the comments that more goes into an evaluation than just a simple test. But if you look at what you're looking at when you're thinking about vision or hearing, yes, it does also have to affect student achievement, but it is not quite the same as the tests we administer for learning disabilities and the amount of bias that can play into those kinds of assessments. And so what they found was that for the kinds of disabilities traditionally identified by healthcare providers and physicians, such as the more vision, hearing related disabilities, this disparity did not exist across race and income. It existed within the disabilities that the school played a larger role in identifying. So students were more likely to be identified for learning disabilities, emotional disturbances, and intellectual disabilities, all of which we consider to have kind of more subjective identification processes. More judgment is used, more observations are used to determine whether a child has a disability that fits those criteria. And I think that this research shows not only that race, that it kind of proves the point that we were discussing before, prevalence versus bias. Race is a factor regardless of income. So it's not just about exposure to different types of environments or events when a child's growing up. It's not just about your ACE score or the trauma or your nutrition. It's not just about poverty. Race itself plays a role and has an impact regardless of students' income. And that's a really important takeaway from the research that was done by Todd Grindle and Laura Shifter. And then the second research question that they set out to identify was related to educational setting or placement. And they found that Black and Hispanic students are more likely to be segregated from their peers or placed in separate educational settings. What we know historically about those separate settings is that they provide less access to high quality educators, less access to rigorous instruction, and less access to opportunities to engage with the general student body. And in many of the worst case scenarios, I know we've seen lawsuits coming out of Georgia and other places. In certain cases, students in separate settings are also educated in really substandard physical environments that are not conducive to learning as well. And so all of that, I think, plays an important role in how students end up achieving and develop. So this research directly looks at identification rates, and it's incredibly important to the discussion and helping us understand how best to move forward. There's other research on very similar topics that help us increase our understanding on the complexities. So we'll take this research out of Harvard about identification rates And I also want to share with you a little bit more kind of on the bias side of what we know about mindsets and how the individuals and the beliefs that we hold within this system can also make a difference in how students are educated. And NCLD has done research over the years that has showed us kind of some persistent beliefs that continue to exist, even though they don't reflect what we know to be true about disability or about learning. And we have surveyed over 1,300 educators. We've conducted a series of focus groups to better understand the experience in the classroom. And we've also surveyed over the years parents and pediatricians as well to really get a sense of what do people believe about students with learning disabilities. And what we found really comes back to mindsets. So even though years of science and years of research have proven learning disabilities are brain-based differences, students with learning disabilities are just as capable and as intelligent as their peers, we found that not everyone believes this to be true. 1 in 4 teachers believe that learning and attention issues can be outgrown, even though research has shown these are persistent problems that carry through to adulthood. 1 in 3 believe that students' learning and attention issues are actually just laziness. And 1 in 4 believe that ADHD is the result of bad parenting. So you can see different kinds of biases, whether it's about a family and how children are raised, or about a family's culture, whether it's about student motivation and how dedicated they are. All of these influence how we interact with students. And the second piece really gets to inclusion. So in those focus groups and surveys that we've done, we found some really interesting data points about mindsets of teachers. 90% did believe that inclusion benefits students who have mild to moderate disabilities. So students with learning disabilities, students with maybe speech language impairments, but that means 10% didn't believe that inclusion benefited those students. And then the numbers grow when we ask about who else benefits. So 64% felt that inclusion benefited students without disabilities, so their peers in the general education setting. Only 64% of teachers thought it was helpful for other students to be educated alongside students with disabilities. And 50% of teachers felt inclusion benefited them as a teacher. So you have half of all teachers thinking, it doesn't make me a better teacher to serve students with disabilities. And there's a variety of reasons teachers may feel this way. They reflected on the behavior management challenges that they face in the classroom. They often felt like it was distracting to other students who were trying to learn. They felt like they were being pulled away from students who needed support. But I think what this points to is that we still have a lot of work to do to ensure that educators truly believe in the value of inclusion, that they believe in the inherent worth of all students to be educated alongside their peers and to be held to these high standards. Particularly if we want to carry out the mandate of least restrictive environment, and we want all students to be treated fairly and supported in an inclusive setting. And then there's another body of research that, I guess I want to add to this, this is part of a report that we put together called Forward Together, and it laid out a whole lot more information about evidence-based practices and mindsets that are essential to effectively educating students with disabilities. And what we did find on the positive side was that teachers who had a positive mindset, teachers who had a growth mindset and believed that all students had potential, and they believed in themselves to be successful educators, that they could learn and they could improve their skill, they were more confident in their ability to teach students, and they were more effective educators for that reason. So I want you to think about, if we change mindsets and we encourage them to build their confidence, we often see better results. And there is a kind of a parallel body of research related specifically to culture and how biases and beliefs about culture can also influence, teaching. And so cultural deficit thinking, and this research comes from Dr. Eddie Fergus, who's at Temple University. He's a scholar and a researcher, and he's doing a lot of work in districts to move the needle and push for systemic change. But cultural deficit thinking is what this research is based on. And it's the belief that poverty influences cognitive ability. And you can probably see why that belief would be harmful. If educators believed that a student from a low-income family or a low-income community was somehow less intelligent or less capable, that the deficit is within the student and not within our society or the structures like poverty and racism that exist, we're going to run into a pretty big problem in terms of expectations that are set for that student, the opportunities that they're given, and how they're treated. So this research that Dr. Fergus engaged in highlighted a couple important things. First, he found that teachers with more deficit thinking have less cultural awareness. And then second, teachers who have higher levels of deficit thinking also have higher levels of color blindness, and they experience discomfort when it comes to dealing with race. So if teachers or other educational professionals are not comfortable acknowledging race or are not culturally aware, how can they serve the diversity of students in our classroom, right? Those are some things that they need to be pretty comfortable addressing and dealing with and recognizing in our society. But on the flip side, if you think about this research, it's showing that, you know, teachers who are confident in their teaching skills have less of this deficit thinking. So this research, as well as research we've done, really points to changing mindsets. If we can build confidence in teachers and equip them with the skills that they need, then their teaching improves. They have less deficit thinking, and they don't see the challenges as with the students, but within the system, and they work to address those. So stronger teachers, higher confidence are essential to us addressing cultural and racial differences in classrooms, and really addressing disparities in education and ensuring equity and access for all students. And all of this, you know, research and data that I've shared leads us to just the fact that we all need to do more to address this. There is a clear intersection here between race, disability, special education, and it's an issue that every community needs to engage on. So normally I would talk about how hard it has been with COVID-19, with this pandemic affecting everybody, how discouraging the current state of affairs is for many people. I think we're all feeling a sense of, you know, frustration, hopelessness, you name it. There's a lot of different feelings, and we're all affected by this. It's a really unpredictable time, and educators are trying to plan and serve students, and things keep changing. But at the same time, you know, in thinking about this presentation, I have to say this is an opportunity, and it's a moment that we cannot afford to waste. Schools have closed, leaders are thinking about student needs, educator needs. There's a lot ahead of us, but in many ways, it's the same challenges we've always had, and it's a different moment. The urgency is greater, the challenges have been exacerbated, of course, but we're being called to solve the very same problems that have always existed and are just now really being brought to the forefront in a new way. So how do we make sure that equity is a part of that? How do we take this opportunity to make sure that special education, equity, and racial justice are all addressed in our efforts to improve schools and adapt to the reality that we're now dealing with today? So I want to share a little bit about what's next. How do we take this moment of COVID-19 and do something that furthers and advances equity in special education? So Congress passed the CARES Act back in March. The federal government provided some funding to states and governors that's supposed to go down to K-12 education. It's clearly not enough funding, and we're really pushing for more funding for schools. The Senate is working now on the next proposal. We're hoping that they'll provide additional funding through that. And districts and states are well underway planning for the 2021 school year. So wherever you may be as educators, if you're at the school level, if you're an administrator, if you are the superintendent level, everyone's voice needs to be part of that conversation. And it's really critical that the people who care most about these kids are the ones involved in that planning process. First and foremost, I think everyone needs to be thinking about families, engaging with families, figuring out what it is that they need and want during this time. Families need to be at the table, and their voices should be part of that conversation. If we want to serve students, we have to understand where their families are coming from, what challenges are in front of them, what kind of cultural considerations there might be. And that's kind of a first essential thing we have to do. But it's also important for educators to speak out, lift your perspective up, speak for these marginalized students that you're serving, for their families. Decisions are being made very quickly about how to spend federal dollars at a local level. Encourage your leaders to spend those funds on the highest need schools, the highest need students, and on things that are going to lift the boat for everybody. Being part of that planning process and making sure that equity is front and center is crucial during this time. So what does that look like? How do you make sure that equity is the focus? How do you make sure that these kids are part of the discussion? And it has to happen in both policy and practice. So I'll touch on both of those things. If you are working at the practice level, if you are somebody interacting directly with students or planning for those who interact with students, there's a lot we can do now that will have a positive impact on special education and the eligibility process to make it smoother, more consistent, more equitable. Schools need to focus on social emotional needs of students. COVID-19, I think we all recognize, has brought with it a lot of trauma for students, particularly students that are hit hardest by this, low-income students of color who have experienced more death, more illness, food insecurity, other challenges. We need to address that trauma and their social and emotional needs, because that is essential if we're going to address their academic learning needs, and it almost has to be addressed ahead of any academic needs. I talked a lot about how hard it is already to tell the difference between a student struggling to learn and a student having a disability. And in this time, if you think about what has been such a traumatic experience, we may very well perceive behavior challenges or mood issues. We may attribute that to disability when really it's a manifestation of an unmet need that the child has had, of their trauma that they've experienced. And so we need to be really careful that we are not jumping to identify students as having a disability and pushing them through this process, knowing what the outcomes may be for students of color. We really need to understand, recognize, and explore that dynamic of their social emotional needs, the trauma that they've experienced, before we do anything related to special education. And so, and in line with that, we need to really reestablish good instruction. For all of the efforts that have been made over the last several months, I think we can acknowledge that virtual learning is really hard. And so doing good, core, high quality evidence-based instruction virtually is a whole new challenge. But we can't identify a disability without first providing good instruction. It's written into the law. For students with learning disabilities, you actually are required by law to rule out that there was not, that they had good instruction, they had good high quality instruction, and they still are struggling. If we can't acknowledge and prove that they did have that educational opportunity and good instruction, we shouldn't then be putting them in a path to special education. So it is hard, but it has to start with professional development. We've got to make sure our educators have all that they need, that they're working off the same script, that they are comfortable in this virtual setting, but they need those core skills that maybe they've been missing for some time, just about high quality evidence-based core instruction for all students. And so getting, in our planning for the fall, we've really got to get as much real-time instruction to students as we can. I know that distance learning for some students was a packet of information, and I don't think anyone can call that good core instruction that we can, rule out as a cause for challenges with learning. And as we're beginning to provide that kind of evidence-based instruction, we've got to implement some kind of progress monitoring. It may be harder to do in a virtual setting, but we need to be tracking growth. We need to know where students are, where they're succeeding, where they need more support. Particularly when we think about learning disabilities, so many districts rely on RTI as the way that they track student progress and determine, are they ready for a special ed evaluation or not? And so that's going to be really incredibly important that we reestablish RTI or MTSS in a virtual learning system. And then finally, we need to communicate with families. I mentioned this already. We can't adequately address the needs of students if we're not acknowledging their culture, the strengths that they're bringing to the classroom, the home life that they're experiencing at this very same time. We need to understand their family's language and other factors that really play into the student's experience. And if we're not knowing and engaging with those families, understanding what it is that they need, we're not going to get to a place where special education is equitable and conscious of these students' identities. And on the policy side, we need policies that support and incentivize those very practices. Last year, regulations went into effect that required school districts to analyze identification, placement, and discipline rates. So they were designed to address significant disproportionality, ensure that every district was measuring those things the same way. So we had a comparison and could identify which districts had the highest disparities, because those districts that stood out as having the highest disparities would then receive funding to address those and to make some changes that would even out the challenges that they were seeing. Last year, Secretary DeVos tried to roll back those regulations. It went to court, and luckily those regulations were upheld in court, and so they are in effect. We need continuous monitoring and enforcement of those regulations so that discipline looks different in a virtual setting. There's going to be some factors that we're not able to track as closely, but we do need to be monitoring closely all of the identification data, all of the placement data, and the discipline data to make sure we can take corrective action when it's needed. And I talked a lot about bias, cultural deficit thinking. These are important issues to address within schools and districts. And we need funding so that districts have the resources to make these decisions and engage in these processes. But we need strong leaders who recognize that doing things like these cultural bias inventories or examinations of an entire district or an entire school are essential. These are inventories that you can work through to identify individual beliefs about race and ethnicity and inclusion, to examine the policies and the practices. How do your IEP team meetings go? How do your decision-making team meetings go when you're looking at RTI data and trying to decide if a student should go to special education? What are those conversations like? What kind of forms do you fill out? And how do we look at all of those to identify any kinds of hidden bias that might exist? And we need leaders that are willing to take that on and really call out the bias and begin to make changes in our systems. One area where we need more research, I think, is at the intersection of English learner status and disability. Many times educators struggle, and rightfully so, to distinguish between a language proficiency challenge and a language-based disability. What might be a disability can be hidden, and a student may spend years in an English learner program without having their disability really addressed appropriately, or vice versa. A student who is learning English and maybe struggling to learn English may be thought to have a disability. And so they get enrolled in special education and they never really overcome those English language proficiency challenges that they had. And so we need instruments that can, be more sensitive to that. We need professionals who are well-trained and culturally responsive and can really work with families and educators to understand what is an English learner or English language proficiency problem and what is maybe something that is more aligned to a disability. And so those are things that we need to just better equip schools to have the resources to do that. And then finally, we need to tackle mindsets. As we talked about, educator preparation programs have a big role to play in this. We need to ensure that teacher candidates who want to enter the classroom actually take courses in disability and understand what it is, that they have an opportunity in real time to build their instructional skills in front of students with disabilities, so they actually don't encounter them for the first time when they step into a classroom as the teacher of record. We need educators to be learning about race, ethnicity, and income so that these things are not foreign and aren't something that they're uncomfortable with or colorblind to when they get into the classroom. And so these gaps in training are really essential for us to address so that we can foster a more inclusive and equitable learning environment for students. And this is a lot of work ahead of us. I see a lot of the comments in the chat. We need more funding. Absolutely, I can say it 100 times. There's a lot of this is going to require more resources, but in addition to that, it's going to require leadership. There can be resources available if people are prioritizing these things. It's all about how you make decisions. And I kind of implore everybody on this call to think about one way that you can bring this issue to the attention of decision makers wherever you may be working, and how you can move it forward in a way that is productive. And there's a lot of resources available on this. If you go to NCLD's website, we have one site dedicated just to resources around COVID-19. The link is here, ncld.org/COVID-19. It has resources on the family school collaboration that I talked about. There's an advocacy toolkit that can be used at a local level to bring equity issues to the forefront when we're thinking about funding and where funding should be prioritizing these students. And then there's a whole lot more resources that you might find interesting about virtual learning and supporting multilingual learners and students with disabilities there. Then there are two other landing pages I want to just mention. ncld.org/SLD eligibility. There's a lot of resources specific to identifying learning disabilities there. But in particular, there is one resource that we worked on in conjunction with Dr. Sam Ortiz. He's an expert in assessment for English learners and students with learning disabilities, and he works out of St. John's University. So this white paper that we created specifically talks about the identification process for students with LD and how it requires schools to consider things like economic disadvantage, environment, and cultural factors in making that decision, and how that often plays out in a way that can lead to bias. So that might be an interesting paper if you want to learn more about learning disabilities and the role of race and ethnicity and income there. And then Forward Together is where the report I mentioned, where we surveyed 1,300 educators, where we talk all about mindsets, and it goes more into depth on how to foster those growth mindsets, positive orientations toward inclusion, and other evidence-based practices. So I will stop there. I know we have a lot of questions in the chat, but I'm also happy if there's a smooth way we can do this for anyone who does want to jump in and ask a specific question. And if you want to put a question in the chat, I'm happy to read it out for everyone and then try to answer it. A question, what is the best way to rule out lack of appropriate instruction in COVID times? So, I mean, I think we all understand that virtual learning is different than in-person learning. When we talk about providing FAPE to students, we understand it's going to look different. We're not necessarily saying that schools need to be doing everything the same. I think the most important, the best way to rule out lack of appropriate instruction is to document, what are the evidence-based practices you have tried with those students, using kind of a tiered model, using RTI or MTSS or whatever your district may be implementing, to make sure you're tracking data, make sure you're getting observations from parents as well. Parents can be such a valuable resource in this. They are seeing their kids at home in a different setting and might witness challenges or successes that teachers aren't privy to because of this virtual environment. So making sure that you are tracking the data, measuring progress on different kinds of interventions in the same way you were doing it in school, and trying as much as you can to get that one-on-one time with students to just kind of informally observe and assess how they're doing. If you do have a record of what has been provided and how you've instructed that student and what their response has been in terms of data and in performance, that is going to be essential to ruling out a lack of appropriate instruction. If you're not collecting data, if you don't have evidence that you've tried different things and that you've been working in a systematic way through instruction with students, I don't know that it's going to meet the criteria that you'll need under the law to actually move forward with an identification, particularly for students with learning disabilities. How do we get training needed to better teach children with special needs? I mean, there are, I guess we can talk a little bit about, teacher preparation programs versus professional development. There are models of teacher preparation programs out there that do, and I think New York and New Jersey are examples where the teacher credentialing process actually includes really rigorous requirements for general education teachers to educate students with disabilities. Not only is there coursework requirements in the college courses that students are taking, but there are requirements in the professional standards that teachers are held to in their licensing, as well as the practical, number of hours they're required to teach in a school setting before they are credentialed. So a model like that is hitting on all three prongs of the teacher's development are important. But in order to get additional training, if you're already in the classroom, there are, professional development kinds of modules that you can engage in. There are a lot of nonprofit organizations that have resources on what are the evidence-based practices that teachers need in the classroom. If you look at Forward Together, the report that I had included at the bottom of this slide here, there is an entire kind of toolkit for principals. So if you are a school leader and you want to include professional development for your teams that get at the exact practices that teachers need to successfully support students with learning disabilities or other disabilities in the classroom, that could be a great resource. It gives action items for people at all levels, whether you're in a classroom, at the school level, if you're an administrator or a state level person. There are different ways you can push for better training and preparation and for more inclusive schools generally. Research on the percent of students of color that have 504 plans. I think the best place to get that data, I don't know the numbers off the top of my head. I think the best place to get that data is the CRDC, the Civil Rights Data Collection. That is the only federal data collection on students with 504 plans, and it is the best source of information I have on that. Another place to look, Dr. Perry Zerkel, he is out of Lehigh University. He does a lot of work looking at 504 plans, but I would say largely 504 plans are not something we have good data on. We don't always know why a student has a 504 plan or what type of disability is being addressed through a 504 plan. So there's still a lot of work to be done there to know if there are any racial disparities in terms of access to those. But the Civil Rights Data Collection might be a good place to start. Yeah, 504 plans are not required to be reported under, we have IDEA data collection where we report on students with IEPs. There is not a parallel kind of reporting requirement for 504, but the Civil Rights Data Collection in their examination of lots of things, do ask that 504 plan students be included under the bucket of students with disabilities. So it includes IEPs and 504 plans under that disability category. And yes, there is definitely a large movement to get more funding. For those of you who may not know, you probably know from your experience how woefully underfunded IDEA is and how much of that burden falls on states and districts to cover the cost of special education. And Congress has had promised when they first passed the law that they would provide up to 40% of the extra cost that it takes to educate students with disabilities in our country. They have never gotten past, I want to say, 19% of that extra cost. And so they have made good on maybe half of their promise. And right now, I think we're somewhere around 13% is the federal funding level. So there is a huge need to get more funding. We have lots of champions in the House and the Senate who have been pushing for this for years. We have plans that will kind of put it on a glide path and incrementally increase funding every year until we get to that 40%. And it is certainly something that we're trying to push for now with the next COVID stimulus bill. All of these funds have been coming through these stabilization funds that are pretty flexible so that states can use them how they need to. And at the same time, we are pushing for IDEA specific funding to help kind of take some of that burden off of states and districts who we expect to have less funds to work with in the coming year. So that is something that is front and center of the advocacy efforts at the national level. Emmy, I know you wanted a couple extra minutes towards the end, so I'm happy to stop here. And for anybody who wants more information or wants to get in touch, my contact information is on this slide. There's a lot of resources at NCLD's website, and we are always happy to talk more or direct you to additional resources if this topic was of interest or you're looking for more information. So I just want to say thank you to everyone for your time, for your dedication, your commitment to the cause, and all of the work that you are doing during this really difficult time. And just want to thank you all for being here.
Thank you so much, Megan, for such a wonderful, informative presentation. We greatly appreciate it. For our participants, these sessions and all of the slides are being recorded. And in just a minute, I'm going to pop both the survey link and the link to the YouTube channel where you can locate all the recordings from this conference as soon as they are processed and uploaded. Again, Megan, thank you so much. I'm sure your time is valuable, and if you need to pop off, we fully understand. I will stay on for a few minutes afterwards and continue to put information in the chat.
Great, thank you. And I'm happy to hang out for a few minutes if there's other questions that people want to pop into the chat as well. And I see the comment on the NAEP data. So we, NAEP provides like these snapshots of data, not, they don't go deeper by disability category. They just talk about students with disabilities in general. So there is newer data on the NAEP. There have been additional administrations of that test since the 2013 data set. When we were preparing to do a big report called the State of Learning Disabilities, 2013 was the latest data we had, and so we hired a researcher to dig into the raw data set that could really get us the data by disability category. We haven't done that since, so I don't have any more recent information about students with learning disabilities generally, but NAEP would have data about students with disabilities generally and how they performed on math and reading in each grade. If you go to just the NAEP website, they usually will issue like these snapshots or data tables that could be helpful to you.